Trafficking is a growing crime, with the number of prosecutions and the number of convictions doubling since 2012. With it being Human Trafficking Awareness Month, the Family Crisis Center of East Texas wants to educate you about this problem. Mariela Gonzalez reports.
A lot of person-on-person crimes, it's underreported and people don't know the resources that they can go to.
A total of 2,373 calls, texts, and online tips were submitted in Texas regarding human sex trafficking in 2023. That's according to the National Human Trafficking Hotline website, which states that 583 of those submissions were from victims or survivors. Human trafficking is defined as forcing or compelling a person to provide labor, services, or engage in commercial sex acts.
They're free to roam about, but because of either brainwashing, grooming, manipulation, they think they can't go anywhere else, and they're being forced to do that.
Mallory Dotson serves as the Family Crisis Center of East Texas Sexual Assault Coordinator.
Most of the time, it doesn't start off with all the violence that they experience.
The agency is taking bath and bedding donations until the end of the month to give to survivors in their shelter.
When someone's with a trafficker, that trafficker is providing everything that they need: basic food, shelter, water.
In 2024, the Family Crisis Center of East Texas served 1,224 clients. 17 of those were human trafficking cases, a number that appears to be increasing every year, says Dotson.
We see a lot of spousal trafficking, familial trafficking that are happening in homes, that people don't even realize that they are being trafficked until they come in here.
Mariela Gonzalez, KLTV 7 News.
And according to the State Attorney General's office, red flags include a person who is overly fearful or submissive, also physical injuries or tattoos on the face or chest, and ID documents being held by someone else. The Human Trafficking Hotline is 1-800-828-7233. Again, it's 1-800-828-7233.